3 weeks after the McDonald's incident, Shaq's black SUV pulled up to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of Atlanta. He checked the address on his phone one more time before stepping out, ducking his head to clear the car door. Under his arm, he carried a gift-wrapped package with bright blue paper and a silver bow. The media storm had finally begun to die down. For days after the incident, Shaq couldn't turn on a TV without seeing his own face. Basketball legend saves mother and child ran across every headline. He'd done a few brief interviews, mostly to direct attention to child safety awareness, but had declined most requests. This wasn't about publicity for him. He pressed the buzzer for apartment 204 and waited. Footsteps pattered on the other side of the door before it swung open, revealing the little boy from McDonald's. His face lit up when he saw Shaq. "Mom, he's here." The boy shouted over his shoulder before looking back up at the basketball star. "You really came." The woman appeared behind her son, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her curly hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her face looked more rested than the last time Shaq had seen her. "Please come in," she said warmly. "We can't thank you enough for everything." Shaq ducked through the doorway into a modest but comfortable living room. Moving boxes were still stacked in corners. They had just relocated to this new apartment with Shaq's help. After what happened, they couldn't return to their old place where Pete had found them. "I brought something for the little man," Shaq said, handing the package to the boy, whose eyes widened at its size. "Can I open it now?" he asked his mother, already tearing at the corner of the wrapping. She laughed, a sound Shaq was glad to hear after everything they'd been through. "Go ahead." The boy ripped off the paper to reveal a basketball in a clear display case covered with signatures. "Wow," he breathed, running his fingers over the plastic. "What are these?" "Those are the signatures of my entire championship team," Shaq explained, crouching down to the boy's level. "And now I want you to add yours right here in the middle, because you're the real MVP." Tears glistened in the woman's eyes as she watched her son carefully sign his name with the marker Shaq provided. "The court hearing is next week," she said quietly while the boy admired his handiwork. "They say with your testimony and the security footage, Pete won't be getting out for a long time." Shaq nodded. "I'll be there. My lawyers will be too. You don't have to worry about legal fees." She shook her head in amazement. "How do you thank someone for saving your life? For saving your child's life?" "I just happened to be in the right place," Shaq said, watching the boy who was now attempting to spin the basketball case on his finger like a real ball. "Your son did the hard part." Over coffee at their small kitchen table, they discussed the boy's upcoming school year. Shaq had arranged for him to attend a private school with excellent security after learning that Pete had made threats from jail. "I spoke with the principal yesterday," Shaq said. "They've got a good basketball program for the younger kids. Might have a future star on their hands." The boy beamed at this, standing a little taller. The trauma of that day at McDonald's still showed in his occasional nightmares and startled reactions to loud noises, but his therapist said he was making remarkable progress. As evening approached, Shaq prepared to leave. At the door, the boy surprised him by wrapping his arms as far as they would go around Shaq's massive legs in a tight hug. "Are you coming to my birthday next month?" the boy asked, looking up. "Mom says we can have it at the basketball court if you want to play." Shaq ruffled his hair gently. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, little man." Outside, the sun was setting over Atlanta. As Shaq drove away, he thought about all the moments that had led to this one. A child's whisper in a crowded McDonald's, a split-second decision to call 911, a mother's brave elbow strike, and now this new beginning for a family that had nearly been torn apart. Later that night, in his spacious home filled with basketball trophies and championship rings, Shaq paused before a photo that had been taken at the police station. In it, he sat beside the boy, both of them making silly faces for the camera despite the serious circumstances. He placed this simple photograph in front of his row of MVP trophies. Some victories, Shaq had learned, mattered more than any game he'd ever played. Outside the McDonald's, the parking lot had transformed into a sea of flashing lights. Police cars blocked the exits while curious onlookers gathered behind yellow tape. News vans were already setting up, reporters checking their hair and car windows before going live. Inside a police SUV with tinted windows, Shaq sat across from the woman and her son. The boy was curled up on his mother's lap, exhausted after the ordeal, but unwilling to let go of her even for a moment. A kind-faced female detective had brought them blankets and hot chocolate from the McDonald's, trying to create some warmth in the sterile vehicle. "Can you tell us what happened?" The detective asked gently, her notepad ready. "Take your time." The woman stroked her son's curly hair, gathering her courage. "His name is Pete," she said, nodding toward the man being placed in a separate police car. "My ex-boyfriend. He showed up at our apartment this morning after getting out of jail last week." Shaq listened quietly as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near us. There's a restraining order. But he kicked in our door while I was getting ready for work and my son was eating breakfast." Her arms tightened around the boy. "He had the gun. Said if we didn't go with him and act normal, like we were all one happy family, he'd—" She glanced down at her son and didn't finish the sentence. "He wanted to take us to his cousin's place in Tennessee," she explained. "Said nobody would find us there. We stopped at McDonald's because my boy said he was hungry. I think Pete only agreed because he thought it would look more normal, like we were just a family on a trip." The detective nodded, writing notes. "And that's when your son approached Mr. O'Neill." "I didn't know what he was doing," the woman admitted, looking at Shaq with tearful gratitude. "Pete had gone to the bathroom, and I stepped outside to try to secretly call my brother. I was so scared Pete would catch me." Her voice broke. "I didn't even see my brave boy go up to you." Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame making the SUV feel smaller. "Your son is one smart kid," he said, his deep voice gentle. "He waited for just the right moment when both of you were distracted. Knew exactly what to say, too." The boy peeked up at the mention of himself, his eyes still wide but now with a hint of pride. "Can you tell us what made you decide to ask Mr. O'Neill for help?" the detective asked him. The boy looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I have his basketball card," the boy said shyly, "and a poster in my room. Mom says he helps kids with his foundation. I thought," he paused, struggling with the adult concepts, "I thought he might believe me when grown-ups sometimes don't." Shaq felt a lump form in his throat. All those charity events, all those hospital visits, all those foundation meetings that sometimes felt like obligations in his busy schedule, and here was the real-world impact, a child who trusted him without ever having met him. The detective smiled warmly at the boy. "That was very smart thinking. You did exactly the right thing." As the interview continued, they learned more about Pete, his violent history, his recent release from jail for assault, his obsession with getting back together despite the restraining order. "We'll need formal statements at the station," the detective explained, "but not tonight. Tonight you both need rest. Is there someone you can stay with?" The woman nodded. "My sister lives about an hour from here." "I'll have an officer drive you there," the detective promised. "And we'll have patrols check on you regularly until we're sure you're safe." As they prepared to leave, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "This has my personal number," he said, handing it to the woman. "If you need anything, a safer place to stay, help with legal bills, anything, you call me. Day or night." She took the card with trembling fingers. "Why would you do that? You don't even know us." Shaq glanced at the boy, who was watching him with those trusting eyes. "Because your son had the courage to ask for help when he needed it. The least I can do is offer the same." Outside the SUV, cameras flashed as Pete was driven away in a police car. Reporters were already piecing together the story, but they didn't know the full truth of what had happened, how a child's whisper to a basketball star had changed everything. The detective closed her notebook. "Mr. O'Neill will need your statement as well." Shaq nodded, but his eyes remained on the mother and son. "Take care of them first," he said. "I'll be around as long as you need me." The McDonald's had transformed from a cheerful fast food restaurant into a scene of terrifying tension. The man inched backward toward the side exit, dragging the woman with him, his gun still pressed against her head. Her eyes never left her son, who clung to Shaq's massive arm, tiny fingers digging into the basketball star's sleeve. "Just let us walk out of here," the man shouted, his voice cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the restaurant's cool air conditioning. "Nobody follows us, nobody gets hurt." The police officers maintained their positions, weapons drawn but held steady. The lead officer, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair, spoke in a measured tone. "Sir, there's no way out of this. Let the woman go, and we can talk this through." "There's nothing to talk through," the man spat back. His eyes were wild now, darting between the officers surrounding him. The hand holding the gun trembled slightly. Shaq stayed perfectly still, one hand gently covering the boy's head, turning the child's face away from the scene. Years of pressure-filled championship games hadn't prepared him for stakes this high. This wasn't about winning or losing a basketball game. This was life and death. The woman locked eyes with Shaq over her captor's shoulder. Despite her terror, there was a fierce determination in her gaze. She gave him the smallest nod, as if trying to communicate something. Then, in a quick movement that nobody expected, she slammed her elbow hard into her captor's ribs. The man gasped in pain, his grip loosening just enough for the woman to duck slightly. It wasn't much, just a few inches of separation, but it was all the opening the police needed. "Drop it now," the lead officer shouted. The man raised his gun, aiming it wildly, but before he could squeeze the trigger, two officers tackled him from different angles. The woman threw herself to the floor as they slammed into him. The gun clattered across the tile, spinning under a nearby table. "Money," the boy screamed, squirming in Shaq's grip. "Hold on, little man," Shaq said firmly, keeping the child secure while chaos erupted just feet away. "Let the police handle it." On the floor, the man thrashed and fought as the officers worked to subdue him. He bucked and twisted with desperate strength, nearly breaking free before a third officer joined the struggle. Finally, they managed to flip him onto his stomach, pinning his arms behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the now silent restaurant. "Clear," one officer called out, weapon secured. Only then did Shaq lower the boy to the ground. The child immediately bolted toward his mother, who was being helped to her feet by a female officer. She dropped to her knees, opening her arms as her son crashed into her embrace. They clung to each other, both shaking with sobs of relief and lingering fear. Shaq watched them, his own heart pounding. The adrenaline that had kept him focused now left him feeling slightly lightheaded. He leaned against a nearby table, his massive frame suddenly feeling heavy. "You okay, sir?" an officer asked, approaching him with respect. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, just glad the kid and his mom are safe." Around them, the restaurant slowly came back to life. People emerged from behind tables and booths. Parents comforted frightened children. McDonald's staff huddled together, some crying, others making phone calls. The man, now fully restrained, was being read his rights as officers led him toward the door. His face was pressed against the shoulder of a police jacket, but Shaq could still see the cold hatred in his eyes as he passed. The lead officer approached the woman and her son, crouching down to their level. "You're safe now," he said gently. "We'll need to ask you some questions, but we can do that somewhere more comfortable." She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks while keeping one arm firmly around her son. "Thank you," she whispered, then looked up at Shaq. "Thank you for believing him, for helping us." Shaq moved closer, his gigantic shadow falling over them like a protective blanket. "Your boy's the real hero," he said softly. "Takes a lot of courage to do what he did." The little boy looked up at Shaq with wide, tear-stained eyes. "I saw you on TV. Mom says you help people." Something caught in Shaq's throat. All his championship rings, his business success, his fame, none of it felt as important as this moment, knowing he'd been there when this little family needed someone to believe them. Outside, red and blue lights flashed as more police cars arrived. The evening news would soon be filled with the story of what happened at this ordinary McDonald's on an ordinary day, all because a 5-year-old boy trusted a basketball star with a whispered secret. Time seemed to slow down in the bright McDonald's dining area. The usual dinner sounds, ice clinking in cups, wrappers crinkling, the hiss of the soda machine, faded into the background as Shaq watched the man's hand hover near his pocket. The little boy stood frozen halfway between the booth and Shaq, his eyes darting between the adults. He was smart enough to sense the tension, even if he didn't understand it all. "Come on, buddy," Shaq said gently, crouching down to be less intimidating despite his massive frame. "Your mom and dad can watch from there if they want." He met the boy's eyes and gave him a tiny wink. The boy took a step toward Shaq just as a uniformed McDonald's manager approached their table. "Everything okay over here?" she asked cheerfully, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. Shaq realized the 911 dispatcher had probably contacted the restaurant. "We're fine," the man snapped, his fingers tightening around the woman's wrist. "Just getting a picture with the basketball guy before we go." The manager nodded pleasantly. "No problem at all. Actually, we've got some fresh fries just coming up. Would your family like some on the house while you wait?" The woman with the curly hair looked up, her eyes flickering with understanding. "That would be nice," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "We're not in a rush." "We are, actually," the man hissed at her, too low for others to hear, but Shaq caught it. Near the entrance, a middle-aged couple walked in, the man scanning the restaurant with too much purpose to be a regular customer. His jacket didn't quite hide the bulletproof vest underneath. His partner, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, positioned herself near the side exit. Shaq kept his smile fixed, pretending not to notice. Two more plainclothes officers entered from different doors, spreading out around the dining area. They moved unhurriedly, like normal customers, but their focused attention gave them away to someone who knew what to look for. The manager stepped slightly to the side, creating a path between Shaq and the boy. "Why don't you go ahead and get that picture?" she suggested brightly. "Our photographer here has a great camera." She nodded toward another employee who had appeared with what looked like a professional camera, though Shaq doubted the young man in the McDonald's uniform was really the restaurant photographer. The suspicion in the man's eyes grew. His gaze darted around the restaurant, lingering on the new arrivals. His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling rapidly beneath his hoodie. The woman next to him noticed too, her body tensing as if preparing for whatever might come next. "Actually, we need to go," the man announced suddenly, standing up and pulling the woman to her feet. "Thanks anyway." The boy looked back at his mother, confusion and fear washing over his face. "But what about your fresh fries?" the manager asked, stepping just slightly into their path. The man's face darkened. "Move," he growled, his hand now clearly reaching into his pocket. That was all the confirmation the police needed. The plainclothes officer nearest the door stepped forward. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them," he said calmly but firmly, his badge now visible on his belt. Everything happened at once. The man yanked something from his pocket, a small handgun that glinted under the restaurant lights. Women screamed. A father at a nearby table grabbed his kids and pulled them under the table. The curly-haired woman shoved her son toward Shaq with surprising strength. "Run!" she screamed to the boy. Shaq moved with the speed that had made him famous on the basketball court. Despite his size, he covered the distance in 2 giant steps, scooping up the boy with one arm while using his massive body as a shield. "Police? Drop your weapon!" shouted voices from all sides as officers converged. The man spun wildly, waving the gun, his face contorted with rage and panic. He grabbed the woman, pulling her against him as a shield, the gun pressed to her temple. "Everybody back," he screamed, "or I swear I'll do it." The restaurant fell deadly silent. Customers crouched behind tables and booths. The police had their weapons drawn but couldn't risk a shot with the woman in the way. Behind the counter, frightened workers huddled together. Only the soft whimpers of children and the harsh breathing of the gunman could be heard. The man began backing toward the side exit, dragging the woman with him. Her eyes found her son in Shaq's protective embrace, and a world of love and fear passed between them in that glance. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled softly in Shaq's ear. "Sir, officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line?" "Yeah," Shaq murmured, tilting his head as if checking something on his phone screen. "But they're getting ready to leave." He needed to buy time without making the man suspicious. Glancing around, he noticed 2 teenage boys a few tables away, stealing glances at him between bites of their burgers. Perfect. Shaq gave them a small nod and smile. It took only seconds for the excitement to spread across their faces. They nudged each other, whispering, then one pulled out his phone. Exactly what Shaq was counting on. "Excuse me," one of the teens called out, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Could we maybe get a picture?" Shaq broke into his famous grin, the one that had sold millions of dollars worth of sneakers and sodas over the years. "Sure thing, fellas," he called back, his deep voice carrying across the restaurant. "Come on over." He stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding to its full height, drawing every eye in the place, including those of the man in the gray hoodie, who paused with a tray of trash in his hands. As the teens hurried over, phones ready, Shaq whispered into his own phone, creating a distraction. "Don't hang up." He slipped the phone into his pocket, the line still open. "How's your jumper these days?" he asked one of the boys loudly, positioning himself so he could keep the suspicious man in his line of sight. "You play ball?" More people noticed the commotion. A couple with a baby came over, then a grandmother with her granddaughter. A small line began to form. Each person who approached was another minute gained, another reason for the man not to rush out with the woman and her son. Through it all, Shaq maintained his cheerful persona, signing napkins and posing for photos while keeping one eye on the booth where the boy sat. The mother seemed to understand something was happening. She was taking her time gathering their things, occasionally glancing toward Shaq with questions in her eyes. The man, however, grew increasingly agitated. He paced near their table, checking his watch and the exits. His fingers drummed against his leg, and Shaq noticed a slight bulge beneath his hoodie pocket. The sight made his stomach clench. Was that what he thought it was? "Yo, big man," the man suddenly called out, his voice cutting through the cheerful buzz around Shaq. "My kid's a huge fan. Mind if he gets a picture too before we go?" The request hung in the air, heavy with hidden meaning. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, nothing like the excited fans surrounding Shaq. This was a test. Shaq's mind raced. Refuse, and the man might get suspicious and rush out. Agree, and he'd have a chance to get closer to the boy. Through his pocket, the 911 dispatcher would be hearing everything. "Sure thing," Shaq replied easily, finishing an autograph for a young girl. "I'm nearly done with these folks." He took his time with the remaining fans, watching from the corner of his eye as the man returned to the booth and whispered something to the woman. Her face went pale, but she nodded. Outside the restaurant windows, Shaq caught a glimpse of movement, a police cruiser slowly pulling into the far end of the parking lot, lights off. Then another, approaching from the opposite direction. His heart pounded harder. Help was here, but timing would be everything. Finally, he waved the last fan goodbye and turned toward the booth. "Come on over, little man," he called to the boy, his voice warm and reassuring. The boy looked up at his mother, who gave a tight nod. The man's hand closed around the woman's wrist as the child slid out of the booth. "Actually," Shaq added, pulling his phone out as if to take a selfie, "why don't Mom and Dad join us too? Let's make it a family picture." He saw the flash of panic in the man's eyes. The trap was closing, and somehow the man knew it. His hand slipped toward his hoodie pocket. Shaq tensed, ready to move. Outside, police officers were quietly entering the restaurant through different doors, trying not to cause a scene. The next few moments would determine everything. The 911 dispatcher's voice crackled softly in Shaq's ear. "Sir, officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line?" "Yeah," Shaq murmured, tilting his head as if checking something on his phone screen. "But they're getting ready to leave." He needed to buy time without making the man suspicious. Glancing around, he noticed two teenage boys a few tables away, stealing glances at him between bites of their burgers. Perfect. Shaq gave them a small nod and smile. It took only seconds for the excitement to spread across their faces. They nudged each other, whispering, then one pulled out his phone. Exactly what Shaq was counting on. "Excuse me," one of the teens called out, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Could we maybe get a picture?" Shaq broke into his famous grin, the one that had sold millions of dollars worth of sneakers and sodas over the years. "Sure thing, fellas," he called back, his deep voice carrying across the restaurant. "Come on over." He stood up slowly, his massive frame unfolding to its full height, drawing every eye in the place, including those of the man in the gray hoodie, who paused with a tray of trash in his hands. As the teens hurried over, phones ready, Shaq whispered into his own phone, creating a distraction. "Don't hang up." He slipped the phone into his pocket, the line still open. "How's your jumper these days?" he asked one of the boys loudly, positioning himself so he could keep the suspicious man in his line of sight. "You play ball?" More people noticed the commotion. A couple with a baby came over, then a grandmother with her granddaughter. A small line began to form. Each person who approached was another minute gained, another reason for the man not to rush out with the woman and her son. Through it all, Shaq maintained his cheerful persona, signing napkins and posing for photos while keeping one eye on the booth where the boy sat. The mother seemed to understand something was happening. She was taking her time gathering their things, occasionally glancing toward Shaq with questions in her eyes. The man, however, grew increasingly agitated. He paced near their table, checking his watch and the exits. His fingers drummed against his leg, and Shaq noticed a slight bulge beneath his hoodie pocket. The sight made his stomach clench. Was that what he thought it was? "Yo, big man," the man suddenly called out, his voice cutting through the cheerful buzz around Shaq. "My kid's a huge fan. Mind if he gets a picture too before we go?" The request hung in the air, heavy with hidden meaning. The man's eyes were cold, calculating, nothing like the excited fans surrounding Shaq. This was a test. Shaq's mind raced. Refuse, and the man might get suspicious and rush out. Agree, and he'd have a chance to get closer to the boy. Through his pocket, the 911 dispatcher would be hearing everything. "Sure thing," Shaq replied easily, finishing an autograph for a young girl. "I'm nearly done with these folks." He took his time with the remaining fans, watching from the corner of his eye as the man returned to the booth and whispered something to the woman. Her face went pale, but she nodded. Outside the restaurant windows, Shaq caught a glimpse of movement, a police cruiser slowly pulling into the far end of the parking lot, lights off. Then another, approaching from the opposite direction. His heart pounded harder. Help was here, but timing would be everything. Finally, he waved the last fan goodbye and turned toward the booth. "Come on over, little man," he called to the boy, his voice warm and reassuring. The boy looked up at his mother, who gave a tight nod. The man's hand closed around the woman's wrist as the child slid out of the booth. "Actually," Shaq added, pulling his phone out as if to take a selfie, "why don't Mom and Dad join us too? Let's make it a family picture." He saw the flash of panic in the man's eyes. The trap was closing, and somehow the man knew it. His hand slipped toward his hoodie pocket. Shaq tensed, ready to move. Outside, police officers were quietly entering the restaurant through different doors, trying not to cause a scene. The next few moments would determine everything. Shaq's heart pounded in his chest, though his face remained calm. Years of playing in high-pressure basketball games had taught him how to hide his emotions. Right now, that skill might be more important than ever. The words the little boy had whispered still echoed in his ears. "The man with me isn't my daddy. He took me and my mom. He said he'll hurt her if I tell anyone." Shaq took a slow sip of his Sprite, his eyes never leaving the table where the boy now sat quietly pushing a chicken nugget around in ketchup. The man had returned from the bathroom and was scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing toward the entrance where the boy's mother was still on a call, her back to the restaurant windows. The restaurant continued its normal dinner service around them. A teenager mopped up a spill near the drink station. A group of office workers laughed at a nearby table. The everyday scene felt strangely disconnected from the dangerous situation unfolding right in the middle of it all. Shaq's mind raced through his options. He could confront the man directly, but that might put the kid and his mom in more danger. What if the guard had a weapon? What if he tried to run with the child? The basketball star had faced down plenty of 7-foot centers in the paint, but this was different. This wasn't a game. The little boy glanced over again, his eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Something about those eyes reminded Shaq of his own kids when they were little, that complete trust that Dad could fix any problem. The responsibility of that trust weighed heavy on his shoulders. The restaurant door swung open as the mother came back inside. She tucked her phone in her pocket and slid back into the booth across from the man. Even from across the room, Shaq could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she positioned herself as far from the man as the booth would allow. Her eyes constantly darted to her son, checking he was okay. "You done?" the man asked the boy loudly enough for Shaq to hear. "We gotta get going soon." The mother reached across the table and gently pushed the boy's soda closer to him. "Finish your drink, baby," she said with forced cheerfulness. "No rush." Her eyes briefly met Shaq's across the restaurant, and in that split second, he saw the same fear he'd seen in her son's eyes, but also a fierce determination. She quickly looked away, but that brief connection told Shaq everything he needed to know. The boy had told the truth. Shaq pretended to check his phone while his mind worked through what to do next. Call the police? Try to pass a note to an employee. Follow them if they left. He thought of his own fame, usually a burden when he just wanted a quiet meal, but now maybe a tool he could use. People were always watching him. The staff knew who he was. There were probably a dozen phones ready to record him if he stood up right now. That visibility might be exactly what this situation needed. The man suddenly stood up, grabbing napkins and gathering trash onto the tray. "Time to go," he announced, his voice carrying an edge that wasn't there before. The mother slowly got to her feet, her hand automatically reaching for her son's. Shaq made his decision. Keeping his movements casual, he pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. With his massive hands partially hiding the screen, he tapped the emergency call button. When the 911 operator answered, he kept the phone close to his ear and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "This is Shaquille O'Neal," he said quietly. "I'm at the McDonald's on Peachtree. There's a little boy here who just told me he and his mom have been taken by someone. They're still here but might be leaving soon." The operator asked something, and Shaq continued, his eyes never leaving the family's table. "The boy is about 5, wearing a red t-shirt and blue sneakers. The mother has curly hair, wearing a white blouse. The man is thin, has a beard, probably in his 30s, wearing a gray hoodie." As he spoke, the man at the other table was becoming more agitated, repeatedly checking his watch. The mother was deliberately moving slowly, helping her son put on his jacket, each movement stretched out as if trying to buy time. Shaq lowered his voice even further. "I think they're in real danger. Please hurry." The sun was setting over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the McDonald's on Peachtree Street. Inside, the dinner rush was slowing down. The smell of French fries and grilled burgers filled the air as families chatted over their meals. In the corner booth sat a mountain of a man trying his best to blend in. Shaquille O'Neal hunched slightly over his table, his massive hands making the Big Mac in them look like a slider. He was wearing a simple black t-shirt and a baseball cap pulled low, but there was no hiding those famous shoulders or that unmistakable face. A few customers had already done double takes, nudging their friends and pointing discreetly. Shaq was used to it. After years in the spotlight as an NBA superstar, businessman, and TV personality, he'd learned to enjoy these quiet moments in public while accepting the occasional interruption for a photo or autograph. He nodded politely at an elderly couple who smiled his way, then returned to scrolling through his phone between bites. 3 tables away, a little boy with curly hair and bright blue sneakers kept peeking over his Happy Meal box. The child was skinny with curious eyes that seemed too serious for someone so young. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. Every few seconds, he would look up at Shaq, then quickly duck back down as if playing the world's most obvious game of peekaboo. Shaq caught the boy's eye and gave him a friendly wink. The kid almost smiled but then glanced nervously at the adults at his table. A tired-looking woman with the same curly hair was arguing into her phone, her free hand waving in frustration as she spoke. Across from her sat a man Shaq hadn't noticed at first, thin and jittery, with a patchy beard and eyes that darted around the restaurant. "I don't care what he said, Tommy. I needed that money yesterday." The woman snapped into her phone, her voice rising. "Look, I gotta go. Call me back when you have actual news." She hung up and sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. The man leaned forward and whispered something that made her face tighten. She nodded stiffly, then stood up. "I need some air," she muttered, grabbing her purse. "Watch him for 2 minutes." She pointed at the boy before hurrying toward the exit. The man's eyes followed her until she stepped outside, then he turned his attention to his phone, scrolling with one thumb while his leg bounced rapidly under the table. He barely seemed to notice the child sitting across from him. The boy looked down at his half-eaten chicken nuggets, then back at Shaq. There was something in his expression that made the basketball legend pause mid-bite, a look that seemed out of place on such a young face. Fear, worry, a silent plea. When the man suddenly stood up and headed toward the restroom, the boy's eyes widened. He looked from the man's retreating back to his mother outside, still pacing with her phone. Making a decision, he slid from his plastic chair and took a few hesitant steps toward Shaq's table. Shaq set down his burger, giving the kid his full attention. Though the restaurant wasn't crowded, the dinner noise provided enough cover for what happened next. The boy approached cautiously, his small sneakers squeaking on the tiled floor. He stopped just beside Shaq's table, looking up at the giant of a man towering even when seated. For a moment, he just stood there, working up courage. "Hey, little man," Shaq said gently, his deep voice soft. "You want an autograph?" The boy shook his head, then glanced back to make sure the man was still gone. Satisfied they were alone, he leaned in close to Shaq. Standing on his tiptoes, he cupped his tiny hands around his mouth and whispered something that made Shaq's blood run cold. The child's words were barely audible in the noisy restaurant, but they hit with the force of a sledgehammer. As the boy's message registered, Shaq's easygoing expression transformed. His eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the child. The boy quickly backed away, returning to his seat just as the restroom door swung open and the man returned, scanning the restaurant with suspicious eyes. The child picked up a French fry and nibbled at it, head down, acting as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and now Shaquille O'Neal had a decision to make, one that might change several lives forever.